Welcome back, MTG Joe here. Today we're going to be doing another installment of the weekly meta breakdown where we look at the top performing decks on the MTG Arena ladder. This particular video will be for the standard best of 3 format. We're going to look at the decks that are pushing people into Mythic, we're going to look at popularity of decks, and we're going to look at the win rates themselves. We also had the Pizzabox Open, which is a free-to-play arena tournament that's hosted by Hollywood Pizza on Twitch. Cash prizes each week. I've commentated a couple times, so they usually have like between 100 and 128 participants. So we'll get a good view from like a tournament sense, what folks were playing, how the actual meta kind of shaped up, and go from there. So we are going to start off with looking at popularity and then focus on individual win rates for like the last week of data. So we're getting the data from UntapedGG, the companion tool that runs alongside Arena's client. It tracks your win rates, aggregates it with other users, and get like these cool stats. So if you want to use Untap, the link is in the video description. Afterwards, I'll paste all these deck lists as well if you want to just copy paste them into Arena and get started. So ignore the May 9th to now popularity of the day, just looks at a single date. It seems like right now, if we're looking at the variable in terms of Platinum to Mythic, we don't get enough deck diversity. It's pretty much like 2 decks that show up. So we're looking Platinum to Mythic, kind of going from there. In terms of popularity, Blue, Black, X, and Black-based decks tend to be the most popular of the week. We have Dimir Midrange and Esper Control making up nearly almost 30% of the meta right now. Slightly different strategies. I would say that the Dimir Midrange and the Mono Black Control, Mono Black Midrange decks are more aligned. They're kind of those mid-range shells, but the Dimir is splashing blue for some like counters and stuff like that, and we'll deep dive into the decks themselves. So that kind of makes up the top. We have 5-color Domain, which is like the Atraxa ramp decks. Some Mono Red, and then Orzhov Midrange. Seen kind of a drop-off in Esper Legends, in line with the fact that more folks are playing sweepers of various varieties, which really punish the Esper Legends decks for going wide. And then Selesnya Enchantments hanging out towards the bottom. If we look at the trend, we see a very stark from like June 28th timeline. We have like Dimir at 6%, and it's jumped upwards to like towards the top. Similarly, we see like this Esper Control went from like nowhere to 15% very quickly. We've seen a decline in like decks like Mono Red Aggro, which has been kind of staticky to like low in terms of percentage. And we've seen the Domain deck kind of like at one point Domain was 16% of the meta, and it's kind of trended downwards as well. So jumping into the stats themselves, we are looking July 5th through to the 12th, Platinum to Mythic rank, 23,000 best of 3 matches being played. And we're going to queue up first with Mono Black Control, Mono Black Midrange. So they banned Bankbuster, they banned Invoke, but Mono Black still putting up that good fight. So it's kind of the older shell with like Evolved Sleepers in it, Tenacious Underdogs, full Liliana package. You got your Trespassers, the 8 removal spells in here, full 4 of Shieldred. You got some Phyrexian Flesh Gorgers, which is like another 3-drop in the deck, but could also be played as a 7-drop. And then Gix Command lets you kind of get the full value toolbox, either buffing a creature, giving it lifelink to help with a race, destroy like sweeper for like go wide strategies, whiting announcements, stuff like that. Kind of unearth effects to hand, return 2 creatures in the grindier matchups, or force your opponent to sack their greatest power. So force them to say sack an Atraxa and get the value there. You got Mishra's Foundries in the mana base. I personally prefer my Rex, just because it's continual, and I find that the Foundries kind of get hit, like, or just kind of scale out. Like, as soon as they get like another 2/2 or 3/3, then your Foundries aren't that great. And then if they gain a lot of life in this particular deck, then it also makes it a little bit harder to kind of race in that sense. Your sideboard, you have Hand Hate and Duress, Parasitic Grasp just for the more aggressive decks. If there's anything human-based, gains you some life. Razor Slash for the grindier matchups, Edict for Planeswalker decks, Path of Peril. This is an interesting one, and it's a question of like, I played a bit of this deck just to kind of get a feel for it. I ended up splashing a couple white sources. It's fairly free in the mana base. You can play like Pain lands or the slow lands, like the turn 3 untapped, just to get a white splash. because destroy all creatures mana value 2 or less. Like, while good against mono red, I feel like you're okay against mono red to begin with, between the amount of removal, Shieldred, Flesh Gorger, Trespasser. So this isn't the best there, whereas like if you have like the sweeper to hit just more things in the bigger mana decks. So I consider maybe that's a question of like, is it worth it? Arena for the grindier matchups, and then a couple Shieldreds also works nice against the Planeswalker decks, single threats, stuff of that nature. The one thing I found playing with this deck, it's slower than the other greed piles. So if your opponent's on like Breach the Multiverse, if they're on just various like heavy counter spells, Sunfall hits you pretty hard. And the thing is, like, a lot of your threats that are brought in for the grindier matchup, Razor Slash and Phyrexian Arena, all get swept up by Farewell. So it's kind of rough in that sense. Personally, I prefer the Dimir Midrange deck, 64%. I think it has a lot of these powerful elements that the black-based deck has in terms of targeted removal, strong Planeswalkers, you have Trespassers, Liliana still, you still have the Shieldreds in there, but then you back it up with like tempo elements that help in those greed piles. Make this appear as a main board counterspell along with Urtai, so flexible in that sense. There's a lot of recurable card draw advantage where the black deck didn't really have a way to draw cards outside of Tenacious Underdog coming back each turn. So you have Fairy Mastermind that can prop, you have Kaido that can draw, you have the other Kaido as well, so and then Teferi. So lots of ways to draw cards. Nice mix of creatures and planeswalkers in here. A couple Myrex in the mana base. Sideboard's fairly similar, just extra removal, hand hate. This is going to have a variety of additional counter spells in here. Edicts, Glistening Deluge for like the white base go wide decks, more Graveyard Trespassers for either Graveyard Hate or just as a tough to kill threat. Arena, Shieldred, so like for the grindier matchups or card draw. Even just like Stonewall, Mono Red, stuff like that. And then Whack for the white-based matchups. From there, we go to the Atraxa ramp pile, the 5-color domain. So this is predominantly a green-white-based deck, as you see. And it is looking to ramp ahead with stuff like Topiary Stomper, as well as Invasion of Zendikar. You can go turn 3 Stomper, turn 4 Invasion, play the 7th land from hand, attack it, flip it right away, which is really good. Ossification, Sunfall, Leyline Binding, all really good interaction spells. This can cost as little as 1 mana to have a flash, exile any non-land. Archangel of Wrath helps you gain life and can be more removal. And it's interesting to see, so you have the top end is always Atraxa, some number of Italis, the Herd Migration, which can be a threat to make a bunch of creatures, but sometimes can just find you a land and gain some life. But we're also seeing Kaya, Intangible Slayer. Another way is just have some flexible removal, card draw, and then just drain out your opponent's life. And then we also have the Tyrannix Rex as a creature that can't be countered and just a really hard to deal with threat once it resolves. Your sideboard is Barrages for the white decks, Disdainful Strokes, Negates for kind of the control big mana decks, Chrome Host Seed Shark for the it makes a lot of creatures. They don't, depending on how they slot the removal, it's like a single threat that could kind of snowball. Knockout Blow for the red-based aggressive decks, but also just like in creature aggro decks in general, even 3 mana is not terrible because it also gains you some life. Some more Rex for the heavy counterspell decks, and Vanquish the Horde as another sweeper. From there, we go to Esper Control, and this is at 58% win rate. So this deck is predominantly going to be winning through Wandering Emperor as a way to just make tokens, or 2 copies of Myrex, or technically a Sunfall token. So it's really just interacting every stage of the game with your opponent. So just a bunch of removal, cut downs, go for the throats, Shieldred's Edict, Void Rend, Sunfalls, Farewells. Then you have some counter spells mixed into there between Disdainful Stroke, Make Disappear, Negate, Dissipate, Card Advantage, and Deluge, just like some incidental Revelries, some card advantage, kind of steal your opponent's stuff with Insight, Scrutiny for card advantage. So really just keep saying no to your opponent. The sideboard, Hand Hate, more counters, Siphon Insight for like the grindy matchups, steal your opponent's stuff. The aggressive matchups, you have Revelry, Chrome host comes in because your opponent generally takes out some removal, so you bring this in. Lockdown for the more aggressive decks, and then Shield Druid as a way to gain some life and kind of punish your opponent. Big Stonewall. I'm just going to mention it, a couple decks here, but they didn't have the best showing like this week, so they were popular, but we're not going to really deep dive into either of these this week. But both the mono red deck is at 51%. It's pretty much the stock list. I'll paste the deck if you're interested, but the popularity, we have like mono red and Orzhov Midrange, which will cover, which each are about 5% of the meta. It's about 50%, one of two games win-loss. Similarly with the Orzhov Midrange deck that had a better showing in past weeks, but I think just with the increase in terms of number of discard spells and counter spells that we're seeing it towards the top end, is kind of getting punished in that regard. Similarly around 50%. So I'll paste these deck lists if these are archetypes you're interested in, but we're not going to really deep dive into either of these this week. And then lastly, we had the Pizzabox open. So we had 99 players, just one short of the full amount. So nice kind of detail here from MTG Melee. These are free to play in if you want. There's cash prizes. In terms of looking at the distribution of decks, Esper Midrange, which is kind of a group all that could be Planeswalker packages, Control, Legends, kind of all coming into that mix, was 61%. Dimir Midrange actually had a pretty poor showing. Similarly with Mono Red, the Mono Black Midrange was about 50%. Mono Black Aggro, so this is where you're going to get some of the nuance where folks name the decks themselves. But we see like Mono White Aggro doing pretty poor. 5-color Ram, 62%. So some interesting kind of stats here. If we look at the top 8, I'll link this so you can see any of the deck lists. So we ended up having Azorius Control, Esper Midrange, Mono Black, Esper Midrange. And if we're looking at these Esper Midrange lists, so this is a Legends deck that made it through. I believe this one's more of a Planeswalker control deck. So there's a little bit of nuance here, but some interesting kind of selections. A lot of Esper in various capacities. Some Mono Black, Azorius Control. There's also the Rakdos Midrange list here, which is kind of interesting. Kind of the mid-range package, but we got like Vraska, Ob, Liliana, Sorin, so like a Planeswalker package, and a Yara in here. So kind of a cool configuration of Rakdos making it there. It was ended up being won by Azorius Control. So Eyelids, I think, finished second last tournament I was commentating. So the two Chrome host, a little bit heavier in terms of Planeswalkers, and then just like the Laydown Arms package mixed into there. It was funny because it seems like Laydown was actually, or Eyelids was in 9th, but the Mono Red player dropped before round 7. This is another interesting version of Mono Red. So moving away from the Kumano package, heavier on the burn spells for Nahiri's Warcrafting, for Reckless Impulse main, 2 Chandra's main as well. So this might be a way to kind of consider this deck going forward, where you're shifting away from like all-out aggro, a little bit more card advantage between Chandra's, Reckless Impulse, having answers to Shieldred main might be a more sensible way to kind of approach this deck. Also, the Urbask Forge in the side seems kind of cool, just a way to make reoccurring tokens against the heavy removal spell decks. Against like against Mono Black or Dimir, if the Forge resolves, they don't have a way to take it off the battlefield, so it just keeps making new creatures every single turn that progressively get bigger. So I'll paste this, you can kind of see, and we'll go from there. So that's it for the week. MTGO's site is doing maintenance, so we can't pull the challenge results right now, but we'll take a look next week. And then I'll come out. I'm going to hold off with Explore and Historic this week, most likely, just given that we're getting the anthologies next week. So we'll look at some of the new decks next week for that. Last thing, you'll see in the bottom left-hand corner, we're trying to get to 10,000 subs on YouTube. We're currently at 9280. So if you enjoy this type of content, you enjoy meta style of gameplay, anything of that nature, drop a like, comment, and subscribe. Free, easy, helps out the channel. Thanks for watching. Hope you have a great one. Stay safe out there.